Outcry over a landmark review hailing Britain as a model on racial equality. The government-backed report, while acknowledging racism still exists, claims the system is not deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities.
The interesting thing about this report is that it doesn't find those disparities landing in racism.
We didn't march last year to be told that our experiences aren't real, that we're essentially making things up, that racism can't exist.
Campaigners, Labour and many who've simply grown up here have called the report an insult and deeply cynical. So will this report, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, now only serve to deepen divisions? Paul and Shihab will take us through it. Also on News at 10 tonight. Why should people have to live like this? Dan with more evidence of Britain's scandalous poor housing.
My mum works so hard. She pays rent every day. She hasn't missed one rent pay. And for this.
Macron puts the whole of France in full lockdown for a third time to fight another wave of COVID. And the boy blacksmiths keeping a family flame alive after lockdown lessons from Grandad.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. In the fraught aftermath of last year's Black Lives Matter protests, the Prime Minister knew he had to do something to calm the seething resentment felt by many in the black community who believe British institutions are rigged against them. So Mr Johnson ordered a report, but if anything, its findings released today have inflamed that resentment all over again. It said Britain is not institutionally racist. Yes, there is racism, but family, class and hometown can all hinder life chances more. It is not just the findings of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities that have been condemned. The choice of its chairman has too. Dr Tony Sewell has produced reports on racism for the Prime Minister before, when he was Mayor of London. So is it any wonder his critics claim that he came up with the conclusions that suit Mr Johnson's purposes?
After all the calls for Black Lives to matter, the answer came today that in Britain they already do. That despite the outcry, there is little to shout about. That all the accounts we've heard of discrimination do not tell the tale of a racist country.
There are disparities. We recognise that, and the disparities that we've looked at are in education, in employment, crime and policing and health. However, the interesting thing about this report is that it doesn't find those disparities landing in racism.
His report concluded that there is no proof of institutional racism in the UK, finding that children from ethnic minorities do as well or better than white pupils, save for those from a black Caribbean background, and that the pay gap between all ethnic minorities and the white majority has shrunk to 2.3%. It points to social class, geography and family setup as more important factors in life than race, arguing that the UK should be held up as a model for other white majority countries.
Like on my back.
But rather than helping the next generation to reach higher, this family feels today's report moves backwards. Having protested last year for equality, they don't recognise their voices in its conclusions.
We didn't march last year to be told that our experiences aren't real, that we're essentially making things up, that racism can't exist, when thousands and thousands of people march the street to say it does.
Ari, do you think life is any easier for Layla than it was for you?
No, I don't think so. I think what is happening now is that it's much more, it's hidden. We assume we're in a different world, but we're not.
The report does contain 24 recommendations for the government, including more careers advice and longer school days for disadvantaged Advantaged pupils, and dropping the acronym BAME, Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic, because not all minorities face the same experience. But beyond that, there is very little concrete advice for the Prime Minister who commissioned it.
Boris Johnson first announced the commission in June last year. His head of policy, Munira Mirza, set it up, having previously suggested that structural racism is a perception more than a reality. Dr Tony Sewell was appointed to lead it, having also worked for Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London. He too has previously said that evidence of institutional racism is flimsy.
People said at the time when he commissioned the report that it was a whitewash, to use a slightly unfortunate phrase. And that's what it's turned out to be, you know. And the argument that institutional racism doesn't exist is just absurd.
And after all the shows of solidarity, many feel today's report is just another gesture. Paul Brand, News at 10.
Well, the Commission focused on key areas of British life, education, employment, health and crime. When we put its findings to leaders in those fields, they told us what they'd read and heard bore little relationship to their everyday experience of racism.
It was a report intended to tackle concerns that millions around the country have to deal with. But what do those who experience racism on a regular basis actually think of it? Today we gathered leading figures from the employment, criminal justice, education and healthcare sectors to get their thoughts on the report's findings.
The government is clearly in denial about the persisting, insidious effect of racism and the fact that it actually exists.
I do feel, though, that it kind of seeks to kind of almost invalidate the experiences of countless people of colour. I don't see how you can possibly say that race is a lesser issue than it is.
One of the things that's been highlighted is this idea that historic racism creates a deep mistrust within communities, and that serves as a barrier that slows down or prevents social progression. Do you think that's fair?
Well, distrust comes from the experience of people. And I represent doctors, and that all the evidence has shown over the decades that doctors from ethnic minority backgrounds have been severely disadvantaged in our health service.
Historic racism is what has led to systems and structures that are built to allow our white colleagues to advance further than the ethnic minority colleagues. What do we call that? Systemic racism. What is that? Institutional racism.
One of the recommendations is that we do away with unconscious bias training. How would that work in your specific industries?
The recommendation to get rid of it is fine as long as we have something to replace it with.
I think it's very simplistic to say that all training is good or bad, or it has value. What's really important is to recognise there's a real cultural problem.
There's a specific quote that I want to read you all. It's in the report. There's a new story about the Caribbean experience, which speaks to the slave period not only being about profit and suffering, but how culturally African people transformed themselves into remodelled African and Britons. What do you all make of that?
I consider that comment to be deeply offensive. How can people transform themselves?
It's almost as though they're trying to put a positive spin on slavery.
I think that quote in itself represents how this report is very convoluted and unaware of its own assessment.
This debate is far from settled, and for this group, one thing is clear. They feel their concerns certainly haven't been addressed.
Well, Shihab joins me now alongside Paul. I'm going to speak to Shihab first. Some really strong voices you were hearing earlier on. I mean, the government isn't saying that racism is not an issue, but that we should perhaps potentially take different perspectives on it from the point of view that disparities and inequalities can rise out of different issues.
I think that's a key thing that we need to think about. They are saying that overt racism is definitely a thing. They highlight in their report that social media in particular is a channel where that happens. They've got some recommendations on how to deal with that. But they are saying there are other factors which impact people. And you've seen in that report that people who are experiencing racism on a regular basis are disputing how accurate that finding is. But there are several things in that report that do highlight issues issues of racism. I've got a few facts in front of me. They include black people are arrested at a rate 3 times higher than white people in the year ending March 2020. The prison population for ethnic minorities is 27%. That's far greater than the percentage in the general population. They also say that during the pandemic, black African men were almost 3.4 times more likely to die than their white counterparts. That's in the report. They've highlighted those specific things. At the same time, they highlight things like the pay gap being smaller than it was before, and that there's not a significant difference for those under the age of 30. They also highlight educational success of ethnic minorities. So there is some balance in there, but it's a difficult balance to strike.
Paul, to you then, really, from how people are regarding this report, and many are saying, look, we can just very clearly see the government's agenda written into this. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, the language in this report is really quite frank, and I think some will see it as bold, but others will see it as blind to reality. And I think the words that we read in the report do essentially reflect the words that we hear from the government, particularly in recent months. For example, the focus on white working class communities and the fact that they often face worse disparities, according to the report, than some from ethnic minorities. We've heard the Equalities Minister speak recently about her frustration with identity politics, what she calls loud lobby groups. She's talking not just about race there, but also about sexuality and gender. And she feels there hasn't been enough focus on where you come from or what your parents do is also determining your outcomes in life. And of course, that fits very closely with the government's agenda to level up, as it likes to call it, the north of England. So I think, despite the fact that, as Shihab's pointed out, there are quite a few facts packed into this report, they just don't match necessarily with the feelings of those who've been speaking about their experiences here.
Quite. And just to reflect, finally, Shihab, this was commissioned, this report, in the wake of those protests that we saw last summer to address concerns and try to get to the truth of this. Has this shifted anything, and has it had any chance of actually quelling some of the anger?
I mean, like you say, the intention was to sort of bridge some of these long-standing divisions. The pictures in the reports show that people took to the streets because they were so concerned by this. I don't think it's settled the debate. I think this is going to go on for some time. In every report that you've heard from both Paul and myself, people are upset about what they've read today. But at the same time, it's a difficult thing for the government to deal with. It's not exactly an easy issue to deal with. So this is probably something we will be discussing for some time ahead.
Indeed, Shihab, Paul, thank you both very much indeed for that. Well, reporting the news often involves highlighting injustice and unfairness, and when Dan and his team started reporting on the terrible conditions in a tower block in Croydon in South London last week, we didn't expect to be quite so inundated with emails from hundreds of other people living in equally shocking properties. The problems we filmed in Croydon, chronic mould, damp and leaks, are found in blocks of council flats across the UK.
For over 50 years, families across Birmingham have called these tower blocks their home. But inside, these buildings are showing their age. In several flats, families showed us the water leaking from their ceilings through light fittings and down their walls, and the damp, damage and disrepair it's left behind.
I've woke up mornings and I've got mould all on top of my plates, all on top of my cooker.
On the morning we arrived, Kaylee was looking after her 5-month-old daughter and 5-year-old son in the living room when the ceiling of the kitchen caved in for the second time in 4 months.
We've had leaks constantly. When the council come out, they don't sort the problem out. It happened in December. They come out, replastered it, but it didn't dry, so it's turned into mould, and then it's dropped down to this morning. To be honest, I can't live like it anymore. It's horrible. I can't make it feel like a home for me or my kids, and it just don't feel homely. It's really horrible, to be honest.
After we left, this debris tested positive for asbestos, and the family are now being moved out by their landlord, Birmingham City Council. They told us the problem is down to poor plumbing by the neighbour above, and there's a high level of tenant satisfaction in their 60,000 properties. We found little evidence of that in the flats we visited here, but tenants across the country are facing the same problems.
So this is your bedroom?
Yes, it is.
Oh, wow, OK. Is that all mould?
Yes, it is.
In West London, Umu lives with her sister and her mum in this 2-bed flat. They say they've had mould like this throughout the 10 years they've been here. And then there's the bathroom.
The place is leaking again.
Constant leaking has caused this hole in this cracked ceiling. The room is covered in mould and damp, and the light hasn't worked for years.
Not even an animal is treated like this, you know. Sorry.
You're right.
Because my mum works so hard, she pays rent every day. She hasn't missed one rent pay. And for this.
Their landlord, Hammersmith and Fulham Council, apologised unreservedly and said no one should have to live in these conditions. The family have been offered alternative properties, but say they haven't been appropriate. We put our findings to the Housing Secretary.
Isn't all this the consequence of a decade of cuts to council budgets and not enough homes being built?
No, absolutely not. We've been investing in housing. We want to see more social homes being built in this country. We've created a £12 billion affordable homes programme to do just that.
There's still going to be fewer homes and less money for councils than there was 10 years ago.
Well, the number of homes being built by councils is actually rising as a result of the changes that we've brought in.
But it's not happening fast enough for the Diativo family in Dagenham. Jennifer, Alana and Eva have to share this one bedroom in this two-bedroom flat. And it's covered in this thick black mould, despite complaints to the council by their parents for the past 3 years.
My younger sister, she coughs during the night and she wakes up with like blocked noses and like just to help me to get her back to sleep.
Barking and Dagenham Council claim this is caused by condensation, but have apologised to the family.
I don't get it. I don't understand how come no one takes any action or responsibility for it and they pass it on to me.
Does it make you angry that nothing's been done?
Makes me sad. Seems I can't do much about it.
You feel powerless?
There is no quick fix to the problems we found in these tower blocks. Often decades old, they are expensive to maintain and difficult to repair. But it's the families forced to live in damage and disrepair, paying the biggest price. Daniel Hewitt, News at 10.
As coronavirus deaths here continue to fall, today's figure was 43 and restrictions are being eased. The opposite is happening in France. This evening, in a live TV broadcast, the French President Emmanuel Macron announced that he was closing schools for 3 weeks. Also, the ban on Parisienne and others travelling more than 6 miles from home will be extended to the whole of the country. And that's all on top of the current 7 p.m. curfew and closure of non-essential shops.
French intensive care wards are filling up once more. France's fight against the coronavirus is as desperate as it has ever been, and its doctors are living familiar nightmares.
Même en famille, on a eu des familles où on a eu.
This surgeon in Amiens describes how in his unit a mother and son have died of COVID at the same time. Their infection was, he says, the direct result of a family get-together. It's unbearable for us, he says, and a very difficult situation to manage.
La gestion de ce type de patients, c'est compliqué, très compliqué.
The French president rejected scientific advice to lock down earlier this year. Shops and schools stayed open and movement was restricted in only the hardest hit areas. Mr. Macron had hoped to limit the damage to the French economy, but a new surge in the number of cases has forced him to rethink.
Mes chers compatriotes de métropole, de l'outre-mer et de l'étranger.
With the new variant, the epidemic is accelerating, he told his fellow citizens tonight, and there is a risk of losing control.
Du variant qui risque de nous faire perdre contrôle.
And so schools are to be closed once more and lockdown measures extended across a country where the vaccination programme has been very slow to get going.
I am frustrated to not have more doses because our coverage is still very low. And as a physician, I know that it's important to achieve a minimum coverage in the population to be really effective.
Vive la République et vive la France.
Lockdown was delayed to give the country a few precious weeks of freedom, the president said tonight. But at what cost? France is about to find out. Geraint Vincent, News at 10.
Well, as France is bringing in new restrictions, the Welsh Government is setting out tonight how it is lifting some of theirs. It confirmed that from April the 12th, travel in and out of Wales can resume, children can go back to school and non-essential shops can reopen. And on April the 26th, it plans to let outdoor attractions and outdoor hospitality reopen too. Pfizer has announced that its vaccine is safe and works well for 12 to 15-year-olds. It's important for them, but also for wider populations for stopping the spread of the virus. And it's getting quite a bit of interest, this story, so we can talk to our health editor, Emily, about this. Emily, it's really interesting. Does this mean that children here potentially could start to be vaccinated, do you think?
Well, potentially, but the government hasn't actually made a decision yet on whether to vaccinate secondary school children. But any approval of a vaccine that can be used on children obviously puts us in a really good position. This trial was in 12 to 15-year-olds. There were over 2,000 children in the trial. Only 18 of them caught coronavirus, and all of them were given the placebo vaccine. So these initial results show it's 100% effective in children at stopping symptomatic coronavirus. I think what this will do, though, is raise an awful lot of questions about whether we actually do need to immunise children, given so few of them actually suffer seriously from COVID. What it will do, though, is ensure schools can stay open. It will prevent outbreaks in school. And perhaps more importantly, it has a wider societal effect. It protects the older people and the more vulnerable people who we know do suffer a lot from COVID, just in the same way that we give the flu jab to children to protect their grandparents. I understand that Pfizer is putting this forward for approval in America, and no doubt UK submission for approval will follow after that.
OK, Emily, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, when the food delivery company Deliveroo talked last week about selling shares, it was hoping it would be a piping hot offer gobbled up by big investment firms and pension funds. But interest in the offer has cooled since then, like an overdue takeaway. Today, shares that were originally expected to sell for up to £4.60 ended their first day of trading at £2.87.
Tonight it was business as usual for Deliveroo, but this has been a day to forget. The company's much anticipated stock market debut will be remembered as one of the least successful London has ever seen. Too many investors weren't buying the hype.
We think Deliveroo's business model is best characterised as a race to the bottom fundamentally, whereby employees are treated basically as disposable assets, which is a very antithesis of what you'd call a sustainable business model.
Deliveroo sees things differently. The company's shares were priced at £3.90, but the share price tumbled on opening, ending the day at £2.87, a fall of 26%. That's humiliating, but not a complete disaster. Deliveroo did sell the shares it wanted to, raising £1 billion for the company and £26 million for its founder, Will Shue. A third of Deliveroo's 50,000 riders in the UK will also receive an average bonus of £600 each. But the few riders we spoke to today were largely unmoved.
There's many problems about Deliveroo I can see. The drivers are not happy, that's the first thing.
Deliveroo sometimes they much priority to restaurant and customer. They're not much priority to rider. Sometimes we have lots of problems.
Deliveroo blames choppy market conditions for the slump in the share price, and conditions have been choppy. But in the last week, a host of large UK investors have also publicly spurned the opportunity to buy shares.
Some fund managers have been put off because Deliveroo is limiting the voting rights of shareholders. There's also a concern that the company will come under increasing pressure to improve the pay and conditions of its riders, and that the cost of doing so will mean the business, which is already loss-making, will struggle to ever make money.
Of course, the doubters may be proved wrong. Facebook's share price nosedived shortly after it listed in 2012, and no one today thinks of Facebook as a flop. Day one as a public company has been embarrassing for Deliveroo, which wants to be seen as a British tech success story, and embarrassing for the government, which was hoping to showcase London post-Brexit as a great place for tech companies to come and raise money. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Chancellor sounded upbeat about the economy today on a trip to Grimsby, insisting there would be a strong recovery as COVID restrictions were lifted. On the subject of the virus, Rishi Sunak told Robert today in an exclusive interview that back in September he made the economic case against a circuit breaker, but said the ultimate decision not to have a lockdown then was the Prime Minister's.
Grimsby, a factory making machinery for manufacturers. The Chancellor here to explain how he's encouraging an economic recovery after the COVID-19 slump. But some say that slump would not have been as great and our health better if there'd been a circuit-breaking lockdown in September.
Many of the scientists were arguing for a lockdown. Dominic Cummings was arguing for a lockdown. You took the other view. I'm just really asking, because you will have to give evidence on this. Do you regret it?
Remember, what my job is, and what everyone's job in the Cabinet is to provide the Prime Minister with the best advice that they can in their area of expertise. You'd expect me in my job to talk about the impact on people's jobs and livelihoods, and ultimately things that are bad for the economy, harm our long-term health as well, and our ability to fund things like the NHS.
There are some who say that you played a decisive role in blocking the lockdown. I think you're saying you played a role, but not necessarily decisive.
I think all these decisions are ultimately ones that the Prime Minister makes, and they're impossibly hard decisions to make.
The Chancellor is here to launch his £25 billion scheme to subsidise investment by companies like this one, BlackRow, via so-called super capital allowances that are intended to accelerate our return to prosperity.
I'm optimistic for a few reasons. We're seeing it here in this business that we're in today. At the peak, half of the workforce was on furlough. Now they are all but a handful back at work. The business is looking to grow, increase employment and invest more. So that's a case study in what's happening across the economy.
So chances are we will get the fastest recovery in 100 years.
I am confident that we're in a good position to recover strongly.
His earlier attempts to keep businesses afloat at the peak of the COVID-19 crisis included giving them emergency loans. I asked the Chancellor if it was appropriate that he'd been lobbied directly by the former Prime Minister David Cameron on behalf of one troubled company, Greensill Capital.
People just feel it's not a fair system that he can actually lobby you directly.
Well, I think it's important that whoever people are, whether they're Prime Ministers or anyone else, that they follow the rules and the guidelines that we have in place for lobbying. And we have those rules in place for good reason. But it is right that as an institution we engage with stakeholders, and we do that all the time when people come with policy suggestions. And remember, we were at a difficult point in the crisis, and it's right that we engage with people. But ultimately the decision was taken not to take the proposal forward.
After the bust, the worst depression possibly in British history. Rishi Sunak is hoping for boom, because all our jobs, including potentially his, depend on it. Robert Peston, News at 10 in Grimsby.
To World Cup football now, and highlights of Scotland's, Northern Ireland's and England's qualifiers are coming up later. Look away now if you don't want to see a terrible defensive blunder by England. John Stones was the player caught in possession, gifting a chance to the Poles, which was tucked away by Brighton's Jakob Modder against the run of play. But Stones helped to make amends with an assist 5 minutes from time to give England a vital win in their group. The final score was 2-1. And finally, homeschooling didn't leave much time for any other kind of learning for most of our children. But over the past year, 2 young cousins from Wrexham have been having a go at being blacksmiths, and they've even set up their own business. Their skill runs in their family, 6 generations of it. They are Ollie and Harvey Roberts, the boys from the blacksmiths.
Metalwork is hard graft, but it's rewarding too, as cousins Ollie and Harvey Roberts have found over the last 12 months. Restricted by lockdown, they picked up Grandad's workshop tools and created a blacksmith business.
At the start, we needed help with everything, but now we've carried on for a bit. He lets us do what we want, and if we need help, we'll tell him, and he'll help us with anything.
The tradecraft is a family affair. The boys are the 6th generation of blacksmiths.
Make that a little stand.
Grandad Tony spent his life cutting and welding and is always nearby, but keen to let them work it out for themselves.
You're a little bit proud? Very. Very, very proud. For doing something that's completely alien to them, especially when you consider the fact that they're only 12 and 13 years old, to go on to do something like this, and for people to ask them if they can you make me a flower, can you make me this, whatever, and they just do it now, they just get on with it.
Entrepreneurship extends beyond the physical work. They often use scrap metal, keeping costs down and hopefully profit high.
The satisfaction of when you make something and then you're finished with it, and then you get rewarded by either giving it to someone and them liking it, or getting paid for making something.
And all of this happens under a watchful eye of another blacksmith, great-granddad Alfred.
They've done very well, the pair of them, and the most amazing thing of all is that they're so enthusiastic about it. They love what they're doing. They never seem to get tired of it. They want to be doing it all the time.
Their lockdown story is one of learning, not perhaps the homeschooling we instantly think of, but skills for life, passed down through the generations. Rupert Evelyn, News at 10, Wrexham.
And that is it for News at 10 for tonight. April the 1st tomorrow, so keep your wits about you and we'll see you then from all of us here and working from home. Good night.